In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get input from a user. So we're basically going to allow a user to input information into our program. And I'm actually going to take the information that the user inputs, I'm going to store it inside of a variable, and then we're going to be able to do something with that variable. So I want to show you guys how we can actually go about getting input from someone. And down here in my Python file, all I have to do to get input from someone is I just have to type out input and then an open and closed parentheses. And what this is basically going to do is it's going to tell Python like, hey, we want to get input from a user, and Python will allow the user to type in some information. And inside of these parentheses, we can actually type a prompt. And so generally when we want the user to enter in some information, we want to tell them what we want them to enter. And that's what we can put inside of here. So I'm just gonna say, enter your name. So we're actually gonna create a little Python app which is gonna allow the user to enter in their name, and then we'll store the name inside of a variable, and then we'll basically just say hi to the user. So we'll say like hi, and then whatever the name they entered was. So what I wanna do is I actually wanna store whatever the user inputted into our program inside of a variable. So I can actually go over here and I can create a variable. I could just call it name, and I could set this variable equal to input. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the value that the user inputs and I'm storing it inside of this variable container called name. And so now I have access to whatever they entered in. So what we can do is we can say print, and inside of the parentheses I can just print out hello, and then I'm just going to add on to this name. And actually, why don't we put an exclamation point? And so essentially we're getting a name from the user, we're storing it inside of the name variable, and I'm printing it out onto the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, and when we run the program, you'll notice down here Python is giving us this little prompt. So it's saying enter your name. And now in here I can actually type in a value. So I could type in Mike, and then I can just hit enter, and Python's gonna go ahead, store this value inside of that variable, and then it's gonna print out hello Mike. And so this is kind of cool, and actually what we could do is we could prompt the user to enter in more than one piece of information. So I could actually copy this line of code, and I'm gonna paste it below here, and why don't we have the user enter in another variable? So we could have them enter in, for example, their age. And over here, we just want to say enter your age. And so now we're able to get two pieces of information from the user, and I could say hello name, and then I can say you are, and I'll print out their age. So I'm just going to print age. So now I'm basically able to get both of these pieces of information from the user. I can get their name and I can get their age. So when we run this program, I can type in both of those pieces of information. So it'll say enter your name. So we could just make up a name like John, and then enter the age. Let's say John is 25. And now it's gonna say, hello John, you are 25. So the program is able to get input from the user, and then it's able to use that information in order to say hi to the user and tell them how old they are. And so getting input from the user is a great way to make your programs more interactive. And here we're just scratching the surface, right? We're just basically getting two, pieces of information from the user, but you can use these inputs to do awesome things in Python. And as we go through this course, you're gonna see some really cool things that we can do with these inputs. In this tutorial, I'm gonna show you how to build a very basic calculator in Python. We're basically gonna build a calculator where we'll get two numbers from a user, and then we'll add those numbers together and print the answer out onto the screen. So this will give us some practice in getting input from users, and we'll also talk about getting numbers from users as opposed to just strings. So I'm really excited to get started on this calculator. The first thing we want to do is create two variables, and inside of those variables we want to store the two numbers that the user wants to add together. So down here I'm just going to say num1, and that's what we'll call our first variable, is equal to, and now I need to get input from the user. So I'm going to say input, And inside these parentheses, I'm gonna say enter a number. And now I basically want to do the same exact thing, but for the second number. So we'll paste this guy down here, and I'm just gonna say num2, and then we'll just say enter another number. So now we're able to store the user's input inside of these two variables. So now all I want to do is just print out the result. So I'm actually going to create a variable called result. So I'm just going to say result is equal to, and basically we just want to add these two numbers together. So I'm going to say num1 plus num2. And now all we have to do is just print out the result. So I'm just going to print result. So we basically have our entire program written out here, and this will allow us to enter in two numbers, and then we'll add them together and print out the answer. So I'm going to click play, and down here we can enter our number. So I'm going to enter the first number, we'll say 5, and I'm going to enter my second number. So let's say 8.0, or let's say 8.3. So now it should print out the answer, but if you look over here, that's not quite the answer we were looking for, right? 5 plus 8.3 is definitely not 58.3. And here's what happened. When we get input from a user, by default, Python is just gonna convert it into a string. So it doesn't matter what we put down there when we're entering the numbers. Python's always just gonna be like, okay, this is a string, that's it. Sounds good, right? It's just gonna make it a string. In order for us to make these num1 and num2 variables numbers, we're actually gonna have to convert the strings that we get from the user into numbers. And so the way that we can do that is by basically just coming over here, and when we add the two numbers together, I can use a special Python function in order to convert those strings into numbers. And there's actually two Python functions that we could use for this. The first is called int. So I could say int, I can make an open parentheses, and I can make a close parentheses. And basically what this is gonna do is it's gonna convert whatever is inside of these open and closed parentheses into an integer number. And an integer number is basically a whole number. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a whole number. In other words, it can't have a decimal point. And so what I could do is I could say int, and I could put these inside of parentheses. And now what this is going to do is it's going to convert both of these numbers into integers, in other words, into whole numbers that don't have decimals, and it's going to add them together and we'll print out the result. So why don't we do that, and we'll just see if this works. So I'm going to click the play button, and down here we'll enter our first number. So I'm just going to enter in a 4, and then I'll enter in a 5. And now you can see it's printing out the correct answer, 4 plus 5. And so that's essentially our basic calculator. But we do have one problem with this calculator. So I'm gonna run it again and I'll show you guys what that problem is. If I wanted to add in a decimal number, so we'll add 4.3 and 5.5, you'll see that we're getting this error. And that's because I'm using this int function up here, and this int function is looking for a whole number. So if I put decimal numbers inside of there, it's gonna break the program. There's another function we can use. Instead of an int, we can say float. And a float is basically just a number that has decimals, so it's a decimal number. And so I can convert both of these guys into floats, and now I'll be able to use decimal numbers. So I can click play, and I can just enter in some numbers. So I could say like 4, and I could also say like 5.5. And now it's gonna be able to add both of those numbers, even if one of them is a decimal. And that's the beauty of using that little float function. So in certain circumstances, you might want the user to only be able to enter in an integer, so a whole number. But in a lot of cases, like in this calculator, we want them to be able to enter any number that they want. So we're gonna use this float function. So I'm just gonna recap what we did one more time. We created two variables, num1 and num2, and we basically stored the two numbers that the users inputted into those variables. And then we converted them into numbers, and we added them together and we printed out the results. So this is a pretty cool calculator. I'm happy with it. Hopefully you guys learned something. And as we go forward in this Python course, you're gonna learn all sorts of ways that we can make this calculator more complex. In this tutorial, I want to show you guys how to build a Mad Libs game in Python. So a Mad Libs game is basically just a game where you can enter in a bunch of random words, so like, verbs, nouns, names, colors, and you basically take all of those words and put them into a story randomly. So over here, my web browser, I just have an example of a Mad Libs. So, down here, we're basically just taking random words like an adjective or a noun or a plural noun and entering them inside of a story. So like you read through the story and then like some random word pops up. And Mad Libs can be pretty fun. And I'm sure you guys have, at least heard of Mad Libs before. But if not, that was just a little introduction. So I want to create a Mad Libs in Python, and this is going to be really cool. So down here I have this like little poem. It just says, "Roses are red, violets are blue, I love you." And so, this is kind of like a classic poem, but I think we should mix it up a little bit and create a Mad Lib for this poem. And so instead of having this red color over here, I want to have the user enter in their own color. Instead of having violets, why don't we have them enter in a plural noun? And instead of saying "I love you," why don't we have them say "I love" and then some celebrity, so celebrity. So this is the basic structure for our little Mad Lib, right? I want to basically have the user enter in a color, enter in a plural noun, and enter in a celebrity. And then I'll take all of those words and put them inside of our Mad Lib, and hopefully we end up with something that's pretty funny. So how can we actually go about building this in Python? Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to be able to get these words from the user, right? That's pretty obvious. So I think what we should do is we should create 3 variables called color, plural noun, and celebrity, and we'll store the user's inputs inside of those variables. So up here, let's create those variables. The first variable I want to create is going to be called color. So we'll say color, and I want to set this equal to the input. So I'm going to say input, and inside of here, I'm just going to give them a prompt. So I'll say enter a color, and we can basically just copy this line of code, and I'm going to paste it down below, and we'll paste one more time. So now we're going to create our plural noun variable. So I'll say plurao, plural noun. And we'll just say enter a plural noun. And actually over here I want to make a colon as well. So then finally we'll create our celebrity variable, and we'll say enter a celebrity. And so now basically we're creating 3 variables called color, plural noun, and celebrity. And inside of them we're storing the color that the user enters, the plural noun the user enters, and the celebrity the user enters. So the last thing we have to do is replace these guys with those variables. So I'm basically just going to add in the color over here, and we're going to add in the plural noun. So I can just go like this. And finally, we'll just add in that celebrity. So now we have a pretty cool Mad Lib, and it should be functional. Everything should work. It looks like it's good to go. So let's come over here and we'll run our program, and then down here in the console we can play our little Mad Libs game. So let's say enter a color. I'm just gonna say magenta. Enter a plural noun. Why don't we say microwaves? And enter a celebrity. Let's say Tom Hanks. So when I click enter, what should happen is we should get our Mad Libs printed out. So I'm gonna click enter, and now we have our Mad Libs. So it says roses are magenta, microwaves are blue, I love Tom Hanks. So it's a pretty good Mad Lib, and obviously, the more print statements we put over here, the better the Mad Lib could be, and we could store as many variables up here as we wanted. This was just a very simple Mad Lib. We only took in 3 inputs, but you could see how you could take something like this and create a little Mad Libs game. So your homework for this lesson is to go off and make your own Mad Libs game, hopefully one that's a little bit funnier than mine. But that's the basics of creating a Mad Libs game in Python. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about working with lists in Python. A lot of times when you're programming in Python, you're going to be dealing with large amounts of data. And when you're dealing with large amounts of data, you want to make sure that you can manage it and organize it properly. And a list is essentially just a structure that we can use inside of Python to store lists of information. So we can take a bunch of different data values, we can put them inside a list, and it allows us to organize them and keep track of them a lot easier. So generally you would create a Python list and you would put a bunch of related values inside of that list, and then you can use it throughout your program. So I'm going to show you guys just the basics of using lists. We're going to look at some of the common use cases and really just get you up to speed with what lists are and why they're useful. So over here in my program, I'm actually going to create a list, and we create a list a lot like we create a Python, just like a normal Python variable. So the first thing we want to do when we're making a list is give it a name. So we want to give it a descriptive name, something that's going to basically describe what's inside the list. In my case, for this example, let's make a list of like friends. So we could say like, here's a list of all my friends. So I can say friends, and I'm going to set this equal to the list of values that represent my friends. And when we want to create a list, we can use these open and closed square brackets. So whenever you use these open and closed square brackets, Python basically knows, okay, they want to store a bunch of values inside of this list. So why don't we go ahead and start adding some values? So we can say like my friends are like Kevin, Karen, and let's say Jim. So here I have 3 values inside of my friends array. So when we're creating a normal variable in Python, generally we just give it one value, right? So I would create a variable, I would give it one value, maybe a string or a number or a Boolean. But when we make lists, we're able to store multiple values inside of the same like little item, inside of the same object, right? And then what I can do is I can access these individual items inside of my program. So inside of this friends list, we're basically storing all of these different values, and that can be really useful. So now that we've stored some values, let's talk about what you can put inside of a list. So you can really put any piece of information in Python. We could put things like strings, numbers, or Booleans. So if I wanted, instead of just putting strings here, I could change like one of these to a number, and I could change one of these to a Boolean, and it wouldn't matter. Python's going to be fine with that. But let's change these back to strings just for the sake of the example. So now that we've created our list, how can we access individual elements inside of this list? It's a good question. I'm going to go ahead and print something out to the screen. The first thing we can do is we can just print out the actual list. So I can just say print friends, and then when I run this program, if we look down here in the console, you can see it's just printing out the actual list of friends, right? But let's say that I wanted to print out a specific element inside of this list. Well, I can actually refer to elements by their index. So each one of the elements inside of this list has a particular index. And the indexes actually start at 0. So we would say that this first element in the list, Kevin, has an index of 0. We would say that this other element, Karen, has an index of 1, and this third element, Jim, would have an index of 2. So even though Jim is technically the third element inside of the list, it has an index of 2. And that's because we start indexing at index position 1. And so that's just kind of how lists work, and that's how list indexes work. So if I wanted to access a specific element inside of my friends list, I can just refer to it by its index. So over here, after we type out friends, I'm just going to type an open and closed square bracket. And inside of this open and closed square bracket, I want to put the index of the element inside the list that I want to access. So if I wanted to access this guy right here, this element, I can just put a 0. So I can say friends 0, and now when I run my program, it's just going to print out that value. It's just going to print out Kevin. If I wanted to access this Jim value over here, I can put a 2. And that will give us that Jim value. You can see right there. So we can access elements based off of their index. We can also access elements based off of their index from the back of the list. So for example, if I said -1 inside of here, this is gonna give me access to this value right here for Jim. And you can see that's what it does. So when we use negatives, it starts indexing from the back of the list. So if I said -2, this is gonna give us Karen. And so you can use the negatives to access items at the back of the list. Just keep in mind though, and this is kind of interesting, We would say this first element here is index position 0, right? But we would say the first element at the back of the list is index position -1. So just keep that in mind. So there's actually other ways that we can access like just portions of this list. So for example, let's say I just wanted to select the last 2 elements in this list and I didn't want to select the first one. Well, in here, I can just say 1 with a colon, and this will grab the element at index position 1 and all of the elements after that. So now we should just grab Jim and Karen, or Karen and Jim in that order. I could also specify a range. So actually, let me add in a couple other elements just so that we can illustrate this better. So I'll add in 2 more names. So if I wanted to, I could select like the element at index position 1 up to the element at index position 3. So it's gonna grab this one, so that's 1, 2, and it's actually not gonna grab the third one. So it's gonna grab all the elements up to, but not including 3. So it'll grab Karen and Jim. So let's go ahead and run this, and you can see it grabs Karen and Jim. So you can either just put like 1 with a colon after it, and then it'll grab that index position and everything after it, or you can specify like a range that you want to grab from. So that's how we can access elements inside of this list, but we can also modify elements. So for example, I could come down here, let's say I want to modify this value right here, Karen. Well, all I have to do is just access that element. So I could say friends and Karen is at index position 1, and I could change this to whatever I want. So I could say friends index position 1 is equal to Mike. And now when we print out friends index position 1, that value is going to be updated. So it's just going to say Mike instead of saying Karen. So it can be really useful to modify values inside of arrays. So it can be really useful to modify values inside of Python lists. So those are kind of the basics of working with lists in Python. And actually in the next tutorial, I'm going to show you guys even more ways that we can use these lists. We're going to learn how to like add elements to a list, delete elements from a list, copy lists, and a bunch of cool stuff with these lists. But for now, this has just been sort of like the basics of working with lists. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using functions with lists in Python. In Python, a list is one of the most important structures where we can store our information. A list basically allows you to take a bunch of different values and organize them and store them inside of their own little list structure. So down here in my program, you can see I have 2 lists. I have a list of lucky numbers, and this is just a bunch of different numbers. And then I have a list of friends. So this could be like a list of somebody's friends, and it's basically just a bunch of strings with names in them. So these 2 lists are storing a bunch of different values. And what makes lists awesome is not only could I store like this many values, I mean, I could store hundreds or thousands or millions of values. And when you're working with a lot of data and a lot of information in Python, these lists are invaluable. So because lists are so important, there's actually a bunch of different functions that we can use with lists. And those functions allow us to do things like modify the lists and get information about the lists. So in this tutorial, I just want to show you a bunch of those functions. We're going to talk about some of the most common and the most popular functions that you would use on lists to make them more powerful and make them more easy to use. So the first thing we can do is obviously just print out a list. So down here, I'm printing out this friends list. And when I run my program, you see down here, we're just printing out all the elements in the list. So it's always good to be able to print out all the elements inside of a list. But there's a lot of other functions that we can use. So one function is called the extend function. And the extend function will basically allow you to take a list and append another list onto the end of it. So I could say like friends.extend, and inside of these parentheses, I can pass in the list that I want to add on to the friends list. So I could say like lucky numbers. And now when I print out this friends list, not only is it going to have all the elements in the friends list, it's also going to have all the elements inside the lucky numbers list. You can see down here we have all of our friends, and then we also have the numbers over here. So that's a really easy way to essentially just like add 2 lists together. We can also just add individual elements onto a list. So I could come down here and I could say friends.append, and this will actually allow me to append another item onto the end of this list. So over here, I could just add another name. So we could say Creed, for example. And now I'm like adding another friend onto the end of this list. So when I run the program, in addition to having the original items that were in the list up here, we also have this additional item at the end. And that append function is always going to add the item onto the end of the list. But let's say that you wanted to add an item into the middle of the list, so like right here or right here. There's another list function called insert. And insert is going to take two parameters. The first parameter is going to be the index where you want to insert the item. So why don't we insert it here at index position 1? I'm just going to say 1, and then I'm going to type in the name of the element that I want to add. So we can just say like Kelly. And now at index position 1, we're going to have the value Kelly, and all of these other values are going to get pushed up. They're going to get pushed to the right one index position. So now when I run the program, you can see we have Kevin, this new element Kelly, and then all the other elements have been pushed off to the right. We can also remove elements. So for example, let's say I wanted to remove this Jim value. All I have to do is just say friends.remove, and I can just type in whatever element I want to remove. So I want to remove this Jim element. And so now when we run the program, Jim is going to be gone from the list, and we just have these 4 guys left. You can also remove all of the elements from the list. So if I just wanted to completely like reset the list and get rid of everything, I could just say friends.clear, and this is going to give us an empty list. So it'll get rid of every single element inside the list. There's also another really cool method which is called pop, and you can just type out pop like that. And basically what pop's going to do is it's going to pop an item off of this list. So when I click the play button, you'll see here that we're left with Kevin, Karen, Jim, and Oscar. So we basically got rid of the last element inside the list, and that's what pop does. It pops an element off of the list. So it basically removes the last element in the list. So we have our list, but let's say that we wanted to figure out if a certain element was in this list, right? If a certain value is in here. So let's say I wanted to check to see if my friend Kevin was in this list. Well, I could say friends.index, and in here I can just pass a value. So I could say like Kevin, and this is going to tell me the index of Kevin. So it'll tell me if Kevin's in the list. So now when I click play, you can see down here it says 0. If I was to say like Oscar in here, for example, now it'll give me the index of Oscar. So that's at 3. But if I put a name that wasn't in here, so like if I put Mike, that's not in the list. And so now we're going to get back an error because it says Mike is not in the list. So that's an easy way to figure out if a specific element is inside of the list. And if it is, then you'll know what index it's at. You can also count the number of similar elements in the list. So I'm actually going to come down here, copy this Jim element, and we'll add another Jim element into here. So I could come down here and I could say friends.count, and we'll pass in Jim. And this will tell me how many times the value Jim shows up inside of this list. So it should say 2, which it does down there, because we have 2 values with the text Jim. And so we have all these values. We could also sort this list. So I could come over here and I could say friends.sort. And what this will do is it'll sort the list in ascending order. So we have a bunch of text here, and you'll see what it does. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to put it in alphabetical order. So you can see we have J, K, O, and T. So the list went from being just random order, like whatever we had up here, to now it's in alphabetical order. And that's also going to work for lucky numbers. So I could say like lucky numbers dot sort, and then we'll print out lucky numbers. And these should now be in ascending order, which I'm realizing they already are up here. But if I was to take this 42 and put it down here, now it will figure everything out and put it in ascending order anyway. We can also reverse a list. So if I wanted, I could reverse this lucky numbers list. I could say lucky numbers dot reverse, and now when we print it out, instead of being 42, 8, 15, 16, 23, it's going to be 23, 16, 15, 8, 42. So it's basically just reverse the order of the list. And finally, there's one more list function I want to show you guys, which is copy. So I could actually create another list and I could make it as a copy. So I could say like friends2, and we could set this equal to friends.copy. And now friends2 is going to have all the same attributes as friends, because it's basically just like copied. It basically took a copy of that friends list. So you can see it's the same exact thing. And copying lists can come in handy in a lot of different situations. So those are just some basic list functions, and just to kind of like, you know, get your feet wet in working with lists. Obviously, like the more you work with them, the more you practice using these different functions, the more comfortable you're going to get. But that's just kind of like a basic overview of what you can do. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about tuples in Python. Now, a tuple is a type of data structure, which basically means it's a container where we can store different values. Now, if you're familiar with lists in Python, a tuple is actually very similar to a list. It's basically a structure where we can store multiple pieces of information. But a tuple has a few key differences from lists that we're going to talk about in this tutorial. First thing I want to do is I want to show you though how to create a tuple. So I can come down here and I can create a tuple, and one of the most common examples of tuples is coordinates. So let's say I had a series of like XY coordinates. I could create a variable called coordinates, and I'm just going to set this equal to an open and close parentheses. And whenever we want to create a tuple inside of Python, we're going to use these open and closed parentheses. And inside of here, inside of these parentheses, we're going to put the values that we want to store. So I could, for example, put a list of numbers. So this could be like my coordinates. I could have like 4 and 5. So this would be my tuple with coordinates inside of it. And one of the things about tuples that makes them unique is a tuple is immutable. And you'll hear that word a lot when we're talking about tuples, immutable. It basically means that the tuple can't be changed or modified. Once we create our tuple up here, you cannot modify it, you cannot change it, you can't add elements to it, you can't erase elements from it, you can't change any of the elements inside the tuple. What you see is what you get. Once you create the tuple, it's as it is, it can't change. So I could come down here and I could print out some of the attributes inside the tuple, and the way I can access them is just by using an open and closed square bracket, and in here I can pass in a index. So tuples are indexed starting at 0, so technically we would say that 4 is at index position 1, and 4 is at index position 0, and 5 is at index position 1. So if I said coordinates 0, now it should print out 4. And down here, we're printing out 4. So if I wanted to print out that 5, we can just put a 1 inside of those square brackets, and now we'll print out that 5. So I can access the elements inside of a tuple. I can easily access each entry, but if I was to come over here and try to change one of the elements, so if I said coordinates and coordinates 1, and I tried to set it equal to something else like 10, Python's actually going to give us an error when we run this program. So I'm going to run the program. You see we get this error. It says type error tuple object does not support item assignment because it's immutable, because we can't change it. So that's basically what tuples are, how we can create them. And you know, a tuple, like I said, it's very simple. You just create it and then you have it. And now I want to talk to you guys about a common topic in Python, which is the difference between tuples and lists. So remember, a list is basically doing the same thing. A list, if we wanted to create a list, we would just use square brackets instead of those parentheses. And if I was using a list, I could assign different values to it. I could basically mutate any of the elements. I could add, delete, modify, change, whatever I wanted with the list. But with a tuple, we can't do that. And that's sort of the basic difference. And really, Python doesn't say anything more than that. It basically just says like one of them's immutable, one of them's not. But in practical use cases, generally people will use tuples for data that's never going to change. So you'll store data inside of a tuple when that data doesn't need to be mutated. That's why something like coordinates is such a good candidate for a tuple, because once you have coordinates, like we're probably not going to modify them, right? We might add other coordinates. So for example, if I wanted, I could create a list of tuples. So I could say like 4, 5, 6, 7. Maybe we have some other coordinates like 80, 34. So here I have a list, and inside of it we have these tuples. But remember, these tuples can't be modified. The values can't be changed. So really, it's just a case-by-case basis. I would say by a huge majority, you're going to be using lists most of the time. Tuples are more of a niche. They're used in more special situations. But there are plenty of situations where you want to use tuples. So if you're in a situation where you want to store data that can't be changed or mutated, then tuples are the way to go. So yeah, that's just some basics about tuples, some basics about the difference between lists and tuples. And so a tuple is a great thing to add into your Python repertoire.